Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. It's been a bit of a cracker of a week so far. Some amazing presentations. Well, today, the epic siege of Malta, the air battle, Operation Pedestal, they are all part of World War II legend. But why didn't the Italians take the island fortress and key strategic hub earlier, perhaps in 1940? That and other questions will be addressed by two guests today, one from Italy and one from Malta, almost like we planned it. So I'll bring them in now. One is an original guest on World War II TV. We have a newbie as well. So good evening, guys. How are you today?
Good to be back. Great to see you.
And Giulio, introduce our new guest, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, go ahead, Giulio.
No, you can introduce yourself, Martin.
Yes, because it's the first time over here. I'm quite excited, Paul. So I have only followed you obviously online. I'm a big fan of World War II TV, apart from other channels. And even though I know that your expertise is mostly on D-Day, me coming from an island which was about to be invaded, but at the last moment it was cancelled by one chap in Germany with the kind of mustache. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to share some of my research. I'm so glad to have my good friend Giulio, who we met also online, and we'll be discussing a topic which also is not very much discussed actually. Because most times people think, yes, Malta invaded, the Germans had something called Hercules. Yes and no, that's only the tip of the iceberg. This is what we're going to discuss today, actually.
Brilliant.
Okay, so I will give a short intro about what we are going to discuss tonight. So this is our starting point. So the myth, what I call the myth of the early capture of Malta. Actually, it started from long time ago. Actually, when I started to study and being passionate about history and especially the Mediterranean theater, I many times came across in few books, but especially in TV documentaries or from the mouth of other historians who perhaps were not so much focusing on the Mediterranean theater, about this sentence. And the sentence is essentially that the Italians didn't capture Malta or didn't occupy Malta when it was undefended, unguarded, whatever. That means in 1940. So I also have a question to the audience. So how many of you have heard this story before? Because myself and many other people I know heard about this myth many times, especially, as I said, in YouTube, and books and TV documentaries. So after studying a little bit more this subject, which I have to say, also in Italian literature is treated perhaps in a few books, in one book in very much detail, and I don't think in the English literature is studied too much, I have to say. So we will try to unpack this, and I studied this topic, and I also made a short video explaining the whole topic on my second YouTube channel. Actually, I have a YouTube channel in Italian, but this year I opened a YouTube channel in English, entirely in English, where I focus on naval topics regarding the Italian Navy in World War II. And Malta, of course, is a big topic that I discussed in the previous months. Then also I met Martin, who wrote a fantastic book on the Maltese point of view and on the propaganda from the newspapers in Malta, and he will tell us a bit more about this. And essentially, this myth about the Italians invading Malta is in 1940 is utterly false. In short, and we will try to unpack this tonight. Invading Malta in 1940 was completely unrealistic for a series of reasons that we will see in detail. Essentially, the forces available to Italy in 1940, the geography of Malta, which is many times overlooked. I went to Malta a few times. I also met Martin, and to be honest, when you see the battlefield, you understand many things. And Paul, you understand this perfectly, I think. And thirdly, the strength of the garrison in Malta in 1940, which was not negligible, we will see. And of course, the political and military situation, not only in Italy, but of the war in the early summer of 1940, especially. So I'm done with my intro, and then it's time for Martin.
All right. So we have to do a step back. We cannot start with 1940, not even with 1939. We have to go very much back in time and give a bit of context. So by 1880, after the unification of Italy, you have the Mediterranean, which was in maritime terms pretty much controlled by the British Navy, because they held the three most important points in the Mediterranean. Its entrance to the west, there was Gibraltar, Malta in the middle, and Alexandria and the Suez Canal to the east. And therefore, any activity happening in the Mediterranean was subject to the surveillance and scrutiny, and perhaps even the intervention of the British Empire. So that meant that the Mediterranean, when we go a little bit outside of that geographical chart, we see that we immediately have the rest of the empire. In fact, Gibraltar, Malta, and Alexandria, and when you go off the Suez Canal, go to Aden, into Indian Ocean, it's the empire. Everything was the empire. And Malta was a very important link, at first as a coaling station, and afterwards, after they changed from coal to other fuels. Okay, Malta was also an important staging point once again for the communications of the empire. This would have also repercussions during the war, not just because the British, despite what was happening in 39 and 40, would do their utmost to keep Malta, especially through Winston Churchill, but also the decision to actually attack Italy in 1943 was because Churchill thought that first he had to secure the communication lines of the empire, contrary to what the Americans were thinking. Yes, Giulio? So when we move ahead, yes, that situation, the military situation had a very hot political situation in Malta. Yes, Malta was a colony, had been a colony since 1813, since the times of the Napoleonic Wars, when the Maltese asked the British to come over and help them to overthrow the French, which has only come in Malta in 1798. Malta was a very important British colony for the reasons I have listed. But there was an issue because traditionally Malta, being so close to Sicily, had very important political and social and economic links to Sicily, and therefore, even going back to the times of the Knights, because in the times of the Knights of the Order of St. John, actually Malta was a fiefdom of the Kingdom of Sicily, or the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And it's only by a coincidence of history that Malta did not end up as part of Italy after unification, but it remained a British colony. But that's a whole different story. So we had the so-called language question. So we had the Maltese elite, the nobles, the literati, the law courts, okay, the haute couture of Malta. They spoke Italian. They knew Maltese, but Maltese was relegated as the language of the kitchen, the language of the lower classes. Okay, so they, with their strong Italian influence and Italian culture, okay, they always express their Malteseness in terms also of their Italianity. This exactly played into the hands of one guy who came to power in Italy in 1922. And that is when things started to get really hot between Britain and Italy. What we see here, this is 1940. So the war has already started, and we see street names in Valletta, the capital, still in Italian, and they were being changed into English. So even as the bombs were falling, the Maltese were still using Italian names for the streets, and even newborns were given Italian names. So we had very easy. And anyone born before 1940 would be called Alfredo, Paolo, Giovanni. In fact, my mother was Giovanna. My mother was not Jane. My mother was Giovanna on her birth certificate. Yeah, so that was the situation. Next slide. But things got hot after the First World War. Italy and Britain were allies in the First World War. And the war, no bombs fell on Malta, although there was one attempt with a Zeppelin to bombard Malta. But Malta was surrounded by U-boat activity. In fact, Karl Dönitz, the famous admiral who was in charge of the U-boats during the Second World War, was prisoner in Malta because he was captured commanding one of these U-boats. And so there was a lot of activity. Malta, being small, was also, affected by international events. So, for example, what's happening in Russia and in Ukraine because of the Eastern Front, there were a lot of problems in terms of cost of living, scarcity of food, and things escalated. So, on the 7th of June, 1919, the Maltese rioted. They didn't riot against the British colonizers. It wasn't directed against the British, but it was a riot set off by the cost of living. They wanted a decent price for their daily bread because bread was a staple in the Maltese diet. Furthermore, after the end of the First World War, with the famous 14 points by President Wilson, people were being promised self-determination. So we had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the solution, the German Empire, and the Turkish Ottoman Empire, new countries coming out of them. Then what about Malta? The Maltese didn't ask for independence, for full independence, but they asked for a degree of autonomy. Okay? And after these riots, the British granted the Maltese self-government in 1921. So the Maltese had, I would say, a minimum of control on internal affairs. When I say minimum, it's really a minimum. So when you have the most important things, that is international trade, international transport, the telegraph, post office, defense, all these were in the hands of the imperial government because Malta would still have a governor. But really local affairs would be dealt with by a new parliament. There was a new Senate. And obviously the political parties participated in these elections. And there was one particular party, the Nationalist Party, which was pro-Italian, okay, actually took government in 1932. And his pro-Italian stance was understood by the fascist government of Mussolini as being a pro-fascist stance. And the British were already sensing that Mussolini was changing the tune. So until 1932-33, Mussolini was quite admired by the British. Even Winston Churchill actually wrote in his favor. Okay, and there was the famous Teresa Front against Germany. So it wasn't already evident that Italy would be a straightforward hostile entity in the Mediterranean. But when Mussolini and the fascist government started declaring that the Mediterranean was Mare Nostrum, our sea, then things started getting very serious. The Maltese government in Malta tried to enact laws which favored the Italian language over the English and Maltese. Things came to a head. The British imperial government actually withdrew our 1921 constitution. Okay, elections were suspended. We became a full colony once again. And in 1934, Maltese and English became the official languages. Italian was no longer considered an official language. It was all out political and cultural war against Italian. Actually, Malta was a hive of Italian spies. And the imperial government actually was quite active in getting rid of this espionage activity in Malta through the Italian consulate. The fascist government in Italy was giving subsidies to the Nationalist Party in Malta because it had a daily newspaper in Italian promoting Italian. So the situation was already very serious, but with the Abyssinian crisis in 1935-36, then it was the cherry on the cake, so to speak. It was then that Britain really understood that they could be at war with Italy. okay, after the Italians invaded Abyssinia, today Ethiopia, and they were expelled from the League of Nations. Malta was put on a war footing. And it was then that they realized how much Malta would be weak against a possible Italian attack. Sicily being so close to Malta, only 90 kilometers away, 60 miles away, 30 minutes flight for bombers and fighters from Sicilian airfields. We saw that during the Second World War. And at the time, RAF presence in Malta, 1935-36, was minimal. We had a very good naval base. In fact, Malta was the headquarters of the British Mediterranean Fleet. Okay, and we had an army presence, which was there only to protect the naval base. So Malta was first and foremost the naval base. So there was a big discussion in the 1930s. What would happen if we went to war with Italy? So the army said Malta is indefensible against a large invasion. We have too few regiments here. The Royal Air Force said, yes, 30 minutes away, the famous slogan, bombers will always get through. Remember, it was at that time. And also Malta would be indefensible. Only the Royal Navy insisted Malta had to be defended, even though they realized that they had to withdraw the fleet from Malta to Alexandria for security purposes. They still wanted to keep Malta. And in July 1939, the Committee of Imperial Defense actually approved the strengthening of Malta's defenses. So July 1939 is just 2 months before the start of the Second World War with the invasion of Poland. All right, and just 1 month before the non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. So the Imperial Defense Committee said, okay, what we need is more anti-aircraft guns, okay, for fighter squadrons, let's strengthen Malta. But there was no time for that. Britain was coming out of appeasement, it was rearming, but it wasn't rearming fast enough to be able to rearm also the empire. So all these promises in 1939 were not kept by 1940, definitely. And from there that we get the myth of the three famous or infamous Gloucester Sea Gladiator biplanes that defended Malta during the first few weeks of the war. That was the situation. The Italians were very strong in their propaganda that Malta was Italian. The Maltese wanted to be reunited with Italy. This was permitted in Malta, obviously. The Maltese would listen to Rome radio on the wireless. Wireless would only be banned after the start of the war. And to counter that, the British introduced the cable radio in Malta, the rediffusion service, and the Maltese would listen to the BBC. But having said that, the British did do something good, even though there wasn't the money during the time of appeasement. And this was, in Malta, they introduced the first radar out of the British Isles. So Malta and Aden in Yemen, two very strategic points, okay? They were given radar. They weren't the first in the empire, and also anti-cast drills and anti-invasion drills were being made. And also Malta was the first in the empire to have the air raid precaution service. So they already knew in 1935-36 that the possibility of war and invasion was very real. But what happened is, as you can see from the newspaper cutting, they thought that the Italians would use gas on Malta as they did in Abyssinia. In reality, the Italians would never use gas against Malta, but that's what Malta was prepared for, gas attacks. So the instructions for the IRP were carry with you the mask at all times, granted, and make sure you have a sealed room in your home in such a way that gas would not penetrate through the apertures, underneath the doors, etc. Little was done against an air raid with real bombs. So in June 1940, we didn't have purpose-made shelters against air raids with bombs. The Maltese would only take cover in basements, in old tunnels from the times of the Nice, railway tunnels, and one of these suggestions was put a good mattress on top of a table in your kitchen and take shelter underneath the table with the mattress on it. So, and we have proof proof of that. That was basically the situation until 1939. The British were very, very, very aware of this, the Navy especially. And in 1939, there was a very important development in the Mediterranean, because Admiral Andrew Cunningham took charge of the Mediterranean fleet. Admiral Cunningham is considered as one of the best, if not the best, British admiral since Horatio Nelson, and he would prove this. Okay, unfortunately for you, Giulio, against the Italians, but but indeed, yes, he was a very, very, very good commander, and he insisted. This is a quote from his book, A Sailor's Odyssey, writing in 1939. Malta is of immense value to us, and everything possible should be done to minimize the damage Italian bombers may do it. We were anxious about Malta and the matter of its supply, also of its lack of fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. That's why the Imperial Defense Committee was suggesting that they should be strengthened, but it was never done. Alexandria, also poorly defended, was a best substitute as a fleet base. The only advantage with Alexandria was that it was very much near the Middle East Command, and also very near the supply routes, okay, supplies from the empire. Malta being alone in the middle of the Mediterranean, everything had to be sent by convoy either from Gibraltar or from Alexandria, with the threat, obviously, Italy, Sicily on the north, and Italian held Libya in the south. So even though there were these protestations, actually, the situation didn't improve. But and the cherry on the cake becomes very, very succulent when we see this. The impression given to the Maltese was that we had a lot of guns and a very powerful air force. This is from the 4th of September 1939. Okay, a cartoon designed by a Maltese, Alfred Gerrata, who was the cartoonist of the Times of Malta. Okay, and you see John Bull there, okay, with the sword and everything, all those bristling guns, okay, the fortifications from the times of the Knights, and a lot of fighting flying overhead. This was a blatant lie. This was just propaganda, pure propaganda. The British knew, and those who worked for the British knew what was the situation, yet the impression given by the governor, by the lieutenant governor, by the chiefs of staff was that, yes, we are prepared for this war. It was totally the opposite. And in fact, in the next slide, we see the new governor of Malta. He took over in May 1940, Lieutenant General William Dobbie, who governed Malta for 2 years between May 1940 and May 1942. And in fact, here he says that Malta is an impregnable fortress. As we shall see, Malta was very pregnable in 1940. Why? Because what he wrote in his book in 1945, we're going to see the quotation soon, what he wrote was a very candid assessment. Yes, the next slide actually shows how much the Imperial Defense Committee wanted Malta to have, promised in 1939, and how much there was actually in June 1940 when Italy declared war. So we have only roughly 1/4 of the heavy anti-aircraft guns, 1/3 of the light anti-aircraft guns, and 0 squadrons. When I say zero RAF squadrons, there was nil. These famous Gladiator fighters were in crates left behind by HMS Glories. Okay, so they were actually part of the fleet era. They were Sea Gladiators. And when they left the Malta, they were commandeered by the Air Vice Marshal Maynard of the RAF. They were assembled. They did it without actually asking permission to the Navy. And in fact, there are stories of the Navy actually trying to understand what happened to these crates. What did they do with them? And they were the only defense in June 1940, and they were flown by flying boat pilots. So the pilots had to, in a matter of a few weeks, a couple of weeks, they had to train as fighter pilots, whereas their flying experience was with flying boats. Next slide. The anti-invasion training exercises continue, especially in the north, because that is from where the landing was expected, because there were very good beaches in the north. The harbor area was too much defended, And this southern part, there was really only one place they could land, Marsashlock. Giulio is going to show you some very nice photographs of the Maltese panorama. And this leaves us with that quotation by General Dobby in 1940, where he summed up the situation. Maybe I have the slide, Giulio, and I conclude with that. No, it's coming later. No problem. Go ahead with yours, Giulio. I think I've given a very exhaustive background of what was
Absolutely.
happening, where you can
Absolutely fantastic, Martin. Someone said
thinking. Thank you.
Someone said in the sidebar, their learning curve today is vertical. So, yeah.
I have an advantage, Paul. We were discussing before we went live. I studied Italian. When a Maltese knew Italian, I read and speak Italian, as Giulio knows, and therefore I can tap into Italian sources. That is the problem with English-speaking authors and historians. They cannot tap in these sources, and therefore it's quite difficult for them to bring along the two sides of the coin. Well, actually, there are three sides, because the German side is not exactly the Italian side.
Yeah.
So there are three
Absolutely
sides.
not.
Absolutely not, yes.
Okay, so coming to the Italian side of things, Martin mentioned the Abyssinian crisis. So that's the point in time after which the Italians, let's say the military leaders, the military planners, started to think that a war with Great Britain could have been a possibility, because bear in mind that up until then, especially the Navy, but also the Army, they were preparing and rearming with the scenario in mind of a war against France, but only against France. In fact, the Italian Navy was building in response also to the French naval construction, and the French were doing the same. Also, this is reflected in the Army way of conceiving the tank development and so on. From the Abyssinian crisis, the possibility of a war against Great Britain started to become real. And then a step further is made in 1938, when actually the Italian Navy is given the task from the Army and the Air Force to study the plan for transferring an expeditionary corps in North Africa and all the supplies also for the Army and the Air Force in the event of a war against not only France and Great Britain, but let's say essentially France and Great Britain. They also consider Turkey, Greece involved, but essentially France and Great Britain. So the Italian Navy went along with the study, and you can easily understand that given the balance of forces, it was a very, very hard task, because Italy was, as I said many times in this channel, the list of the great powers. And in this scenario, it would have confronted two quite big naval powers, if not, of course, also economic powers and military in general. This plan essentially came to the conclusion that to transfer these forces in North Africa, it was essentially it was important to transfer a lot of stuff during peacetime, so before the outbreak of the hostilities. And then after the outbreak of the hostilities, there was the need to organize a monthly large convoy escorted by essentially the entire Italian fleet, to make sure that the convoy would arrive safely and fend off any French or British attack. But of course, this was not a guarantee of success. The study recognizes the threats posed by Malta and Bizerte. Bizerte is, it's in Tunisia, held by the French at the time. Because this could have been bases where naval and aerial units could be based and to harass the Italian supply routes, as actually it happened during the war. In addition, there were also logistical issues due to the limitations of the Libyan ports, and also, I would say, the position of the Libyan ports. You have Tripoli, but of course, Tripoli is very far from the Egyptian front. Then you have Tobruk, which is the closest port to the Egyptian front, but Tobruk had a very limited capacity. And then you have Benghazi in between. So these were the problems. Malta is identified in this study as a potentially big problem for the reason I explained before. And the study mentioned that there is a temporary solution and a definitive solution for Malta. The temporary solution would have been neutralization by air bombing, of course. The definitive solution, the solution that would eradicate the problem, was, of course, the occupation. However, these few lines, but very effective lines dedicated to Malta in this study, said that we don't rule out the possibility that with just air bombing we could neutralize Malta, but of course we have to recognize that Malta is able to pose a threat, and perhaps we should have some stop and goes in the run of the convoys.
Reminds me of Kasserring, of neutralizing Malta in April 1942. Same mistake.
Yeah. No, actually, this study was quite right, and also was able to foresee pieces of the future. The thing is, also, I would say the Regia Marina, so the Italian Navy, was a victim of the propaganda of the fascist regime of the Air Force, as the British did. Probably the fascist propaganda was very successful in impressing the world with the capacity of its Air Force. There is a moment in which level bombers are believed to be the definitive weapon against everything, including ships. But as there is a background noise. Okay.
It's Martin's end somewhere. I'll mute Martin from it. I don't know what's going on.
So I was saying they managed to impress the world, but in the end, the level bombers, as we know from the World War II experience, they were absolutely not the major threat for ships. These were torpedo bombers and dive bombers. And especially the Regia Aeronautica found itself in a very weak position because of the overall limited number of aircraft that could be deployed in the course of the war. And also, this is also true for the air bombing campaign against Malta, the limited quantity of heavy bombs, like from 200 kilos and above. So that's what the 1938 study told us, but there was no other follow-up about anything close to drafting a plan to invade Malta. But why? Essentially, the Navy could not plan alone anything against Malta because the Navy didn't have infantry units. I mean, they have, but a few battalions of marine infantry, and then sailors, a quota of the sailors on each ship, but you cannot use this for a major invasion from the sea. Then the army was not really interested. But especially, as I put here, Italy would have faced an impossible situation because you would have to devote resources in a situation where you really have limited resources after Ethiopia, with the Spanish Civil War and the Italian support to the Spanish fascists ongoing, where you have to devote resources to a nightmare scenario where you are going to face France and Great Britain. So you can understand that it makes little sense to devote efforts and resources to this kind of planning. And so a weak basis to develop this, because this was a scenario that should have been avoided in that sense. And especially due to the strength at sea of the Marine Nationale and of the Royal Navy, you would have had to conduct a naval invasion without command of the sea, or for a very limited period of time. So you can understand that this is a huge problem for an amphibious assault. Amphibious assault without command of the sea are usually something crazy to carry on, and this we will see will come again in the planning towards 1940, June 1940. Then, I mean, we go on the road. The escalation goes on. We come to the start of the World War II. In September 1939, Italy does not get involved immediately. Italy declares non-belligerence, so essentially it means neutral, but leaning towards the Germans. But it's also interesting to study from a diplomatic point of view the fact that between September 39 and January 1940, Italy is really leaning behind the Germans and the Allies. What do I mean is that, to give you an idea, Mussolini orders the reinforcement of the defensive line at the border with Austria, which at the time was annexed by Germany. So improving a defensive line against Germany, with which you are supposed to be an ally. And Italy was also still selling arms and materials to France and Great Britain. Because Italy, again, was in a dire situation. There were a lot of talks about the lack of foreign currency reserves. So Italy needed to export stuff abroad in order to get gold or foreign currency to buy the raw materials needed for any kind of rearmament. And also one example is oil for running the ships, especially the warships, and also the merchant navy. So Italy was really in a problematic situation. And then the January 1940, March 1940 is the period when Mussolini, due to a series of reasons, including the supply of coal, because at the time coal was a primary source of energy, and the biggest supplier of coal to Italy were Great Britain and Germany. So you can understand the geopolitical implications of this. So long story short, I also made a video about this and the coal issue that Italy faced, and how the maritime blockade of the German coal transferred by sea from the Netherlands to Italy affected Mussolini's decision to slowly get to the side of the Germans, also because the Germans at some point were able to transfer all the coal that Italy needed by rail. So that was a huge thing for Italy. Then let's say in this period, Mussolini decides to enter the war. At the end of March, he issues this secret memorandum to the chief of staff of the armed forces, where essentially he says, we will enter the war. We will enter the war on the side of Germany, but since we cannot afford a prolonged war, we ourselves will decide the timing of our entry into war. So essentially, Mussolini was deciding the best moment to enter, the best moment before the end of the short war, because Mussolini perfectly knew that he could only afford a short war. That's also why at the end he decides for the intervention few days after in the last days of May, when the front in France is collapsed and the situation is really changing. So in this situation, the Navy, after the memorandum of March 1940, starts preparing various plans, including this first draft for an actual invasion of Malta. I mean, studying the subject in detail and understand the feasibility. So the planning starts in April, in April and goes on in May and June. And this draft, and actually this image I put here, is from a document I found in the archive about this plan from spring 1940, where somebody also make a draw of Malta, and with the areas which were defended and the possible areas where the Italians could land. The study mentioned that 40,000 men were required to invade Malta, and 80 medium landing crafts, which we will see in a while, were needed for carrying out this amphibious assault. The problem was, at the time, Italy had only 5 out of the 80 needed landing crafts. And these probably are mostly unknown in the English-speaking world. These are these landing crafts I'm referring to. This is the first one, the Adige, and then the Adige was followed by 4 units of the Sesia class. As you can see, these are small landing ships that could also carry some tankettes and artillery pieces, and also artillery tractors. And if packed to the limit, they could carry 500 men each. So quite decent landing craft that could land the entire force of the San Marco regiment, which was the Italian Marines, to say. But these were landing craft that could be used for a small, let's say, large commando raid, let's say. And the thing is, this is a picture of I think the Adige used in the occupation of Albania in 1939. Another, let's say, event that is a part of the prelude to World War II when the Italians invade Albania. There are a lot of problems with the landings, especially in the ports, but also on the shores of Albania. But everything goes well because the Albanians do not fight back. But there were already some alarming bells sounding there in this operation. But as you can see, they could come very close to the beach and drop their bow gate, let's say, and then enable the people and also the vehicles to land. This picture is, you can see an entry tankette disembarking from these landing crafts, and this picture refers to the 1942 trainings in preparation for the famous Operation Hercules, Operation C3. But this will be another story that we will touch another episode probably. Also, I wanted to mention that at this point in time, really nobody in the world is able to launch major amphibious assaults. There are powers, of course, especially the British and the Japanese, who have landing crafts. But as the Norway experience tells us, also the British were able to land a force the size of a brigade, more or less. So nobody was able to launch major, let's say, division or multiple division style invasion. The Japanese had the Daihatsu, this landing craft that also inspired the Higgins boat developed by the Americans. But to give you an idea, also the Americans in Guadalcanal disembarked less than a division of Marines. The Japanese launched several marine operations, but again, against heavily defended targets, as the case of Wake Island can testify. They had major problems in that. So Italy was not in the best position, an amphibious, large invasion from the sea. But in 1940, nobody was really in the position to do so. The Bragozzi are, let's say, the arranged solution to fill the gap of these 75 missing landing crafts. The Bragozzi are a wooden fishing boat used in the Adriatic Sea that they could be, the mast could be removed, some plates could be installed on the sides, and they could work as arranged landing craft, and they could carry around 80, maybe 100 men, depending on the arrangements. So these were considered because they were the only possibility. They had a shallow draft, so they could beach themselves on the shores of Malta. And this again is another picture from the trainings done in 1942 in preparation for the invasion of Malta, which never took place. And as you can see, you see the Italian troops training actually in the coast of Tuscany, not far from where I live. They were training to disembark from the Bragozzi. The San Marco regiment I explained before, it's they are the Italian Marines, and the 2 battalions were available in 1940. So around 1,000 men, let's say. With 1,000 men, you cannot invade Malta. And why you cannot invade Malta with 1,000 men? It's because also the garrison, I couldn't find a source that definitely told us the exact amount of the defenders of Malta. So I cross-referenced some sources. There is a nice website called Malta Garrison, which tells the story of many of the units deployed in Malta, like from the 19th century until the Cold War, I think. And then also the National Army Museum, which is a fantastic website from Great Britain, where you have the story of each many regiments in the history of the British Army. So you can retrieve the in some cases the amount of soldiers that were in Malta in these regiments in the period between May and June 1940. So this is the order of battle, and you can see that there was around, I estimated, because in some cases I couldn't find a precise number, so I put an estimate, a lower estimate, given the average size of the British Army battalions. 11,400 defenders, more or less, including the 300 Maltese of the Malta Defense Volunteer Force, which Martin can confirm they were essentially civilians, paramilitary personnel.
Yes, like the Home Guard.
Yeah, the Home Guard. That could have.
But that was the King's Own Malta Regiment. They were proper soldiers, not. Home Guard, yes.
But the King's Own Malta Regiment is listed here. I was mentioning the Malta Defense Volunteer Force because they could have proved themselves very useful for scouting, observation activities, but also as anti-paratrooper patrols. That's something very important.
In fact, later they were renamed King's Own Malta Regiment Militia, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the era of these kind of units being renamed every other week, isn't it? It's like the British Commander. It's 1940, 1941. You start on a Monday with one designation. By the Friday, you've had your title of a unit changed twice. So it's local defense, militia, volunteers. It's that era.
Yeah. Then of course these troops would have had some Bren carriers and also anti-tank guns and artillery pieces. Then there were the static defenses, and actually I made up this map of Malta based on the other sources and information I had. I placed the location of the static defenses, like the main gun batteries, the medium gun batteries, and also the pillboxes, the towns, the radar stations, because once you have the information about the forces that the Italians could master, the garrison station in Malta, you have to understand the geography of Malta. Of course, I encourage everybody to travel to Malta because it's an amazing place, especially for history lovers. But then you really understand the problem in invading such a place. You see the many icons depicting the batteries, and then you see this black line, which is the Victoria Line. It was a 19th century era fortification, defensive line that, you could claim it's outdated for World War II standards, but could prove very well effective against infantry armed with light weapons. And then there are very few places where you can land in Malta, and be sure that these places would have been very much defended or packed with mines in the sea, in the approach to the beach, and so on. And then here's a zoom. These places are the two big bays, Melilla and St. Paul's, on the north eastern coast. And these other very small bays, Martin will excuse my pronunciation, so Mishkuka, Tufia, Sneina, and Irri. I don't know, probably I butchered the pronunciation.
Mishkuka, Tufia, Jneina, Irri.
Oh, perfect.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Actually, they're pretty much Arabic names. Tufia has apple. They come from Arabic. They're very, very old place names. That's why.
Yeah.
Not like Victoria Lines, which was built when Queen Victoria was reigning.
So this picture is from Google Earth, so anybody can check. This is Melilla Bay. The beach that you see there, it's around 800 meters long. and it's at the end of, as you can see here, of a bay where,
Yeah.
if you approach the beach, you can be shot from left and right. And then the beach is only 800 meters wide. Paul,
Did
you
you
know
ever
perfectly that.
Did you ever swim there, Giulio?
Yeah, no. In
No, I tell you
Melilla,
why.
no.
I tell you why. That beach
Yeah.
is so shallow that the landing craft would actually touch the sand very much away from the actual coast, and they would have the soldiers, the Marines would have to wade in slowly. Okay, it's far worse than Omaha Beach in 1944. I tell you, because there would be walking in the water, there would be obstacles, and there would be barbed wire. And when they reach land, they are surrounded by hills, as you're saying. So they would receive fire from three sides. It would be suicidal.
Yeah. And then,
Worse
as I
than
said,
Omaha.
800 meters, while Paul, Omaha Beach is like 6 kilometers, something like that.
Yeah, 4.5 miles. Yep, yeah.
So the thing is gets much more complicated with St. Paul, which is only 300 meters wide, so even smaller. So the perfect killing ground for any invading force. And then you have the western bays, which are even smaller than St. Paul's. And then you see that there is a sloped terrain immediately after the beach. So you can imagine how hard it is to land. And then if you manage to successfully land there, then you have to climb and defeat the defenders who are awaiting for you on the top of the hill. So it's not easy to land in this place. This is an actual picture of Tufia I took a few years ago. Then this is the southern coast. It's a piece of the southern coast, but you can check on Google Earth that the southern coast is essentially rocky and high rocky coast, which is very hard to. It's almost impossible to land there. Although later the Italians will plan to land there, but this is also a story for another episode, maybe. The northern coast is also quite rocky. The beaches are shallow, so it's not great also to stage a land here. And especially this area closer to Valletta is so hardly defended by coastal batteries and also installations and defensive positions. And then, of course, here's an overview of the various pillboxes that you can still find in Malta as you go around. Also very close to the beach. This is St. Paul's, and this is an aerial view of the Victoria Line. So rocky ridge with walls, fortification, and stuff. So imagine these poor infantry guys that would have made it to the beaches that have to face this wall, which is very hard to overpass. And then, last but not least, as I said before, what about command of the sea? Any reasonable invasion plan for an amphibious operation would require total command of the sea, because you have to support your forces and you must allow supplies to flow in. But at the time of this planning was made, and still before the collapse of France, the Italian Navy could muster only 2 battleships, because the other 4 were were undergoing completion works. So only 2 battleships were available, and these 2 battleships would have faced, of course, with the cruisers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and stuff. They would have faced the Marine Nationale and the Mediterranean Fleet. The Italians estimated that they had a window of 36 hours before the arrival of the Allied naval forces. So the invasion forces would have had to capture Malta in 36 hours, which is, you can understand, is completely unrealistic given what we just said.
Just a couple of questions about the before you move on, Giulio. A couple of questions we had about the defenses that we'll deal with. Lancaster Law said, would those pillboxes originally have been camouflage, or that you or Martin And then Trevor
Indeed,
asked, are
yes.
there minefields as well? So, and that could be both land mines or sea mines. So camouflage and mines.
Okay. I go first, Giulio.
Yeah, I mean, for
Yes,
the
the
pillboxes, you
pillboxes.
know
Yes,
better.
pillboxes were camouflaged. Actually, the first pillboxes were built with the rubble wall or something like that. But those built later on were made of concrete. But they were made to blend into surroundings.
Okay.
And as to mining, as far as I know, the British did not mine the seas about Malta. It was the Italians and the Germans who mined
Right.
the seas. So getting convoys in and out was quite tricky. Several ships were lost, actually, trying to get into the harbor or getting out of the harbor. But what the British did was they had boom defenses. For example, the Marsashlock Bay in the southeast, there was a boom defense. And that bay was earmarked for the landing of the tanks in the 1942 invasion plans. Apart from boom defenses, yes, there were some other obstacles, and this is quite interesting. They resurrected the old fugas from the times of the knights. What are fugases? Fugases are like sort of booby traps. They are holes in the ground filled with gunpowder, and they would be set off once soldiers trample on them. So that concept, they kept it. Actually, they found the holes. They filled them with explosives, and they were ready to go off in the same places where the Knights of St. John actually were expecting the probable invasion from the Ottomans 300, 400 years earlier.
It's a massive rabbit hole. Thank you for that, Martin, because but eventually when you're talking about, as Giulio is saying there, a limited sized invasion force without the benefit of, superior World War II type technology, a fortress island like Malta, the old fortifications would still do a very effective job. Even in 1940, a wall is a wall is a wall. A trench is a trench. A big thick lump of stone is a big thick lump of stone, whether you've got a spear or a rifle. It's fascinating that in this particular scenario, the fact that Malta had been defended by numerous groups of people over numerous centuries all kind of added to the picture.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have one comment about the naval mines. I'm quite sure there were naval mines placed by the British around Malta. The Italians estimated that there were around 1,000 naval mines around the island, but also something could be placed in the shallow waters, in the most likely places where a landing could take place. But
but not very large minefields, like, for example, that sealed the fate of Force K in 1941, a very large minefield near Libya. We're not talking about that size. Yes, limited, geographically limited. Yes, indeed.
So to conclude about the pre-war plan, I mean the almost pre-war planning, this study was not very optimistic, and later we will see the final version. It was not very optimistic, and it listed the reasons. First of all, the strong defenses that were observed in Malta, and then the problem of the temporary command of the sea, which could not grant successful invasion of Malta. Then, very important, what was the purpose? I mean, at this point, the Italians are still planning to enter the war, but hopefully a short war from their perspective. The Royal Navy has abandoned Malta at this point. There are no aircraft based there. So without the prospect of waging a war in Libya at this point, I mean, North Africa at this point, and with the weak military presence in Malta there, it's pointless to launch such hard an invasion without the means, without the command of the sea. For what? So it should very much put in the context of the spring. Things will change a little bit with the collapse of France, but this is something for later. So, Martin.
Indeed. Yes, and this is what I was referring to earlier, where General Dobby, the governor of Malta, wrote about the situation in 1940, just at the end of the war, when he published his memoirs. Our Air Force in Malta was a makeshift affair. So far as anti-aircraft guns were concerned, we were nearly as badly off. Our defenses were hopelessly defective. This should be music to the Italian ears. As regards to the danger of invasion, our other resources to meet it were also thoroughly inadequate. So here we have a very good case where the Italians are saying, yes, we'd like to do it, we don't have the means. And the British are saying, the Italians would like to do it, and they will probably succeed. But the British obviously don't know that the Italians don't have the means, and the Italians probably don't know that the British are actually very frightened of this invasion. But this is war. This is the fog of war, call it however you want, but this is exactly what was happening in 1940. And I would like Paul, need to refer back to our earlier comment. This was the Second World War, yes, but remember, the Second World War in 1939-1940, apart from the Blitzkrieg, which was a revolutionary way of conducting war, the rest of war operations were very traditional.
Yeah.
So we had use of paratroopers by the Germans in Holland, and that was it. So it was one time, but it was only, I think, 1941 and 42 that we really saw. So even strategic thinking, technical thinking coming in, combined operations, real combined operations, which they realized were very successful at because they were real allies, not the Germans and the Italians, not really cooperating at all levels to that effect. So yes, so going back to the plan of 1940, what in my opinion was missing and was going to be a core component in 1942 was the paratroopers. Because what was the most important thing in Malta as a base? The harbor with its facilities and the airfields. And in 1942, they decided, okay, forget the harbor. There's nothing there actually. There's no fleet. But if we take the airfields, then they wouldn't receive any reinforcements. We would airland a whole regiment. These would actually act as a cushion, as a buffer against a British counterattack and allow for the seaborne invasion to commence. Basically, that was the plan for 1942, which as we see, it was the earlier plan of 1940 had matured. Okay, with the German contribution and even the Italian experience of war. So yes, in 1940, Malta was ripe for invasion, but the British were not at all convinced they would hold it. But when they saw the Italians acting that way, just bombing, doing high-level bombing, doing very minimal damage, and no invasion force actually coming inside. Their intelligence, British intelligence at the time, which we must not forget, there wasn't Ultra at the time. Ultra came later. But British intelligence wasn't convinced that the Italians were anywhere near preparing for the invasion of Malta. So the situation, so from the military side, we know what was there. Malta was there for the picking for the Italians. Unfortunately, they didn't have the means to scoop it. But regarding the political situation, okay, it got even worse because as Lieutenant General Dobby took over from Charles Bonham Carter, who had to leave early because of ill health, and Dobby started rounding up these pro-Italian Maltese, these sympathizers, including the head of the Nationalist Party, who was also the editor of the Italian language newspaper, the former editor of a church newspaper, and several other officials from the party and Italian sympathizers. And there were some comments actually and some questions about them. It's very easy what happened, okay? The British did not trust them because they had openly professed their pro-Italian sympathies for years, not necessarily their pro-fascist sympathies, because many of them were supporters of Italy and were sympathizing with Italy even during the First World War, when Italy was an ally, even before the First World War, when Italy had liberal governments, when Italy was a democracy. So it was irrelevant whoever was in government in Italy, as long as it was Italy, there was this sympathy. But they couldn't trust them. They were interned, as one of our followers was saying, yes, they were interned in Fort Salvatore, they were kept there. Then in February 1942, they were exiled to Africa, and they ended up in Uganda, not in Madagascar, ended up in Uganda. And they stayed there almost until the end of the war in 1945. Even after the armistice on the 8th of September 1943, they were not allowed to come back. But eventually, as things cooled down in Malta, because the front moved to the Italian peninsula, there was no longer any direct threat to Malta in late 1943 and early 1944. So yes, arrangements were made for their comeback, and they came back in 1945. However, in July 1942, the Maltese courts, they decided that their exile was illegal because they were never charged of anything. These poor guys, hundred of them, they were never taken to court and charged of anything. This group. There were others who were charged with sedition, and they received light prison sentences. In one case, there was an execution, the famous case of Carmelo Borghesani, and he was executed not strictly for spying, but for becoming an Italian soldier and fighting for the Italians against the Greek allies. Okay, and the law had been changed by then, and capital punishment was reintroduced in 1942, and he was the only one to be executed. And obviously, the Italian fascist government squeezed as much propaganda as it could from this case of Carmelo Borghesani, who was a genuine pro-Italian Maltese. He was Maltese 100%. He was an artist, but he professed his sympathies. He went to Rome. He has studied art over there. So yes, but that's the political part. But this continued, and in fact, one interesting thing that happened in Malta, that these pro-Italian sympathizers were being called Quislings. So Quisling was Vidkun Quisling, the pro-Nazi Norwegian politician. But the term, as soon as it appeared in the international press in April, was adopted by the Maltese press, and this label was being used against the Maltese pro-Italian sympathizers. And in fact, the leader of one of the major parties, pro-British parties, here, the Constitutional Party, that is the cousin of the editor of the Times of Malta, Major Strickland, even called for the death penalty for these Maltese. But this continued throughout the war. So instead of referring to the fifth column, just the famous fifth column, which had already been introduced as a term, in Malta we use Quislings. Quislings there, Quislings there, and that's another story.
Yeah.
But this continued. And then it all boiled down what happened on the evening of the 10th of June. Some of Maltese who had the wireless radio actually would listen to Mussolini declaring war. And if you watch the video clips from that famous speech, and you notice that there were placards with these names, Mediterranean names, Corsica, Tunisia. One of them was Malta. Why? Because Malta had to be liberated. Malta had to become part of Italy, like Corsica, like Tunisia, like Dalmatia. Okay, this had to be redeemed. And in the case of Malta, redeemed from British colonization. But the Maltese were split. Okay, many were still Italian sympathizers. However, when the first bombs started to fall, many Maltese who had genuine sympathies for Italy, they were extremely angry at the Italians, because they never thought that our Italian brothers and cousins, because that's how we consider the Italians and the Sicilians. Okay, the connection actually with Italy, I think it was deeper than with Britain after 140 years. And so they were very angry. They didn't expect the Italians to actually really throw bombs, okay, and have civilians as collateral damage. But it never died out. And so I would say the majority of the Maltese actually became actively involved in the defense of the islands. And Malta was put not on a war footing, because earlier. The measures had been taken earlier, as I have already explained. So the British feared an attack by gas. The food supplies were quite limited, contrary to, once again, propaganda that was being dished out by the government, okay, by the colonial government. We had only a couple of months' supply. And this was laid bare in 1942 when commissioners from London came to Malta and they did a report on the food situation. And the first few days of the bombing were chaotic. You need to read the memoirs and the biographies, okay, of what happened. Thousands of people fleeing from Valletta and the big cities as refugees, choking the roads after the first air raids on the morning of the 11th of June. Government offices, actually, people went to work and then disappeared by 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning. So it was total mayhem. And in fact, the British were feared there would be a breakdown in civil order. But that didn't happen because, as everything in life, you get used to it. And one of the things that we got used to...
Quick question for you, Martin, while that slide is up on screen there. Lancaster Law asked, was there ever a possibility of evacuating either the entire population of Malta or at least sort of non-essential personnel somewhere like they did with Gibraltar?
Yes, the non-essential naval personnel, yes, and other personnel from the armed forces were evacuated. One of the last to go actually was the wife of Admiral Cunningham, because this is one of the stories of war. She said, I cannot leave the island. I cannot be the first one to leave. I need to give an impression that everything is calm, everything is going to plan, will be fine. She was one of the last to leave, because remember that even though the fleet had moved from Malta to Alexandria, then moved back to Malta, then moved back to Alexandria, people were coming to and fro, and many officers in the Royal Navy had their families with them, so they would go with them to Alexandria or to Malta. Yes, non-essentials, especially the families of officers in the armed service, they were evacuated, but there was no question of evacuating the Maltese civilian population. No, they had to endure it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and one of the sites of the welcome sites was the site of the famous gladiators, which this is one of the myths of the Second World War. Yes, they existed. They were in three. There were more than three, and they never flew as a Vic formation of three, because there weren't enough pilots, there weren't enough spare parts to have them flying the three of them day in, day out. So usually they would come up as one or maybe two. This is from the records, from the RAF records. They try to intercept the bombers, and the bombers they try to intercept, especially the SM-79 Sparviero, the Hawk. The Hawk was quite fast, and the only way they could actually have a shot at them was if they went into a dive. And the gladiators managed to down a couple of these Sparvieros, but they were nothing. We had to wait for the Hurricanes, which came later on in June, once again commandeered by the Air Vice Marshal Maynard. They were on their way to Egypt, and he just told them, look, you're going to stay here, stay put, you're not going anywhere. And he just kept them there. This is N5519. One of the gladiators. We have one in Malta. I don't know whether you've seen it, Paul. We have the Fate, yes, and they are right now. They are rebuilding Charity. Okay, another gladiator. They recovered some parts from the sea, because the only gladiator shot down was Charity. Fate is still with us, restored, and Hope was destroyed on the ground. But Charity actually was shot down. The pilot, Timberwood, survived, okay, with some burns, but he survived. Yes, in a way, they were truly heroes, these flying boats, pilots flying old, obsolete fighter planes against a less obsolete Regia Aeronautica, if you allow me, Giulio, because we have another question. But was the Regia Aeronautica up to scratch in 1940?
Yeah, you've been keeping an eye on the side, but I was going to ask you that later.
Yes. Compared to the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, the Regia Aeronautica was obsolete. Why? Because they did a lot of developments up to the Spanish Civil War. And when they tested their equipment in the Spanish Civil War, and the Regia Aeronautica acquitted itself quite well, much better than the army, okay, they said, okay, so we have a very strong Air Force. However, things were developing so fast that between 1936, 37 and 1940, their Air Force became obsolete in tactics, in training, in armament, in logistics, almost everything. Only in late 1941 and 1942, the Regia Aeronautica started seeing really effective fighter planes like the Mach 202 with the German Daimler engine, which they had on the Messerschmitt 109s. So yes, so,
Martin, only to add that also the industry could not cope with the
yes, of course, wasn't
wartime
prepared.
attrition.
Yes,
Because
yes.
even producing biplanes was hard for the Italian
Yes.
industry. So
And some of the engines were actually radial engines licensed from Britain. I don't remember exactly which plane, but it had a Bristol Mercury engine, I think. Yes, licensed from Britain. So one of the pilots, George Burgess, actually was famous. He shot down 6 planes, a couple of them in the Gladiator. But this is what he said, George Burgess. There is no doubt that the gladiators did not wreak death and destruction and on any of the enemy, but equally they had a profound effect on the morale of everybody on the island and most likely stopped the Italians just using the island as a practice bombing range whenever they felt like it. Okay, this is a British take on things. At this moment, the Italians were not really frightened of coming to Malta, but as time passed, late 1940, early 1941, when the number of anti-aircraft guns was really increased in Malta, and anti-aircraft gunners, Maltese and the British regiments gained a lot of experience. Then the Italians had to switch to night bombing. And there were instances where bomber crewmen had to take pills before coming to Malta. In fact, there are diaries when they said, prima di andare a Malta. So they, even at night, they were really frightened about the effectiveness of our anti-aircraft barrage. The Germans, they couldn't care less. That's why when we talk about the illustrious Brits of 1941, of January 1941, where the Illustrious was bombed and was hit while in the Grand Harbor, it wasn't sunk. So the Illustrious limped away. But at what cost? These 2 squadrons were decimated. They were decimated. Okay? One of their commanders, I don't remember his surname, actually started crying when going back to Sicily, because most of his squadron had been lost over Malta. So it was at a huge price. But that's the Germans. So back again to you, Giulio.
Oh, actually, there were these pictures I added because I went together with Martin to this place. This is the top of Fort Sant'Elmo, where there is the piece of one of the first Italian bombs that fell on Malta, and there is this monument with the names of the people of the Royal Malta Artillery that fell on that day. This bomb. So it was very touching moment, I would say.
Indeed.
And then here's the rebuilt fighter control room in the very nice museum of the Lascaris room that you can visit in Malta. This is where the fighter defense was conducted in Malta during. It's back to you.
Yes. So we cannot underestimate the role of the civilians, especially later on in the war, because on the surface, yes, they were pro-British and they were part and parcel of the defense, and mostly they obeyed the curfews, the rules. You know, there would be black market like everywhere. Okay, some would actually couldn't care less about the curfew, but mostly things went quite smoothly. And as things progressed, actually, the defense of Malta was being likened to what happened during times of the night when Malta was besieged by the Ottoman Turks. And there you have this recall of past glorious battles. We have the Navy, Army, Air Force, and the civilians dressed as knights fighting against the enemy. This time it was the Italians and the Germans. And what do we see here? that even if the invasion force had landed in Malta, they would have also to face the civilians, the angry civilians, armed with their hunting rifles. And I'm not joking here. Why? Because we have a lot of stories of German and Italian crewmen bailing out, okay, descending over Malta, and they would be butchered before the British would intervene and take them as prisoners.
Mm.
The Maltese civilians did not take prisoners. And this wasn't the first time in in Maltese history. So actually, some pilots were saved in the nick of time. There is a famous incident in one of the best books about RAF in Malta during the Second World War by Dennis Burnham. He was in Malta between April and June 1942, one of the first times, and he recalls how he saw a bailed crewman of an Italian bomber actually swimming underneath the cliffs on the northwest of Malta. He saw them clearly there, and when he turned around to go and land in Taqali, he couldn't see them anymore because rocks, boulders were thrown onto them. They were killed. So yes, that would have been the situation faced by any invader in Malta between 1942 and between 1940 and 1942. Add to that also the propaganda sentiments in Malta. I'm quoting this in Maltese because the Maltese were mainly the perpetrators of the myth of the Italian coward. And here you have this headline. On the Times of Malta was slightly different. So on sea and on land, the Italians flee the Allies. The Italian fleet hides in its ports. And maybe Giulio here will tell us that no, it wasn't hiding in its ports because at the time the strategy was different. Not seeking the enemy, but having a fleet in being and trying to have the confrontation between battleships, etc., etc. And also another myth that the Italians were so afraid that they flew very high, that so high they could even say hello to St. Paul and St. Peter. Yes, they flew high because they didn't have dive bombers at the time. They were still training their pilots with the Stukas. So high-level bombing was their strategy. Were they effective? Were they precise? Yes and no, it's debatable. Like any high-level bombing strategy. Just look at what the Americans and the British achieved between 1943 and 1945. Only a very small percentage of the bombs actually hit their target. When I say small percentage, single digits. Wow. Unfortunately. Yeah. And my last slide before handing word over to you, Giulio. So a very big ally for Malta was Winston Churchill. He firmly believed in Malta, and he would go out of his way to supply Malta. The first supplies to Malta actually came in August 1940. Now, take a step back. August 1940, okay, dust has settled a bit. More the Mediterranean has been going on since the 11th of June. Yes, but Britain had the German knife at its throat. August 1940 is the height of the Battle of Britain. Even when England and Britain itself was under threat of invasion, Churchill could spare a squadron of a squadron of Hurricanes to Malta. And Malta was reinforced in August and September and in October and November and December as much as possible with Hurricanes. Okay, so he really believed in that, believed in Malta as an able base, and he pushed for Malta to become an offensive base. And this is when the Italians really started to say, we should have invaded in 1940 because we have a very good reason to invade it now, because Malta was starting to really worry the Italians about the supply routes between Italy and North Africa. Not in the numbers that we were started seeing in the books after the war, because the percentages varied a lot. Okay, so in 1940, early 1941, the percentages of Italian convoys to North Africa lost to British offensive operations was quite low. Then It went very high in autumn of 1941 when there was Force K, a force of cruisers and destroyers operating from Malta. It was practically sunk to a ship when they hit a minefield near Libya. So it was the darkest period for the Royal Navy. So you have Force K, you have Repars and Prince of Wales in December 1941. There were a lot of things going against the British during that month. Although the United States would come into the war to the relief of Winston Churchill. But anyway, that would actually stretch the Royal Navy even further. So yes, so he would push for several of the convoys for the resupply. He would actually recall Dobby in May 1942 because he was too tired. He was too tired. Replaced with Lord Gort, okay, who was the commander of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk in 1940. Gort did a splendid job in Malta, in defending Malta. And also, but it's 1942, we're talking about 1941. Things had changed very rapidly, and 1942 was the pinnacle, was the most important part of the war. And it was when, as you have and your guests have said, Paul, in many alive, that it could have gone either way, but it went to favor the British. But let's go back to 1940. But I think, Giulio, you would agree with me that we cannot understand 1940 without looking at also what was happening in 1942 and the plans for 1942, because they were taking some of the experience and the miscalculations that they had done in 1940. They were trying to remedy them in their plans in 1942.
Brilliant stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in 1941 and 1942, the Italians realized the threat that Malta now is posing, but then they come to the same conclusion that it's still the geography is still there, the defenses are still there, and they are not capable to launch a large invasion. That there will be a build-up that would lead to a situation in summer 1942 where an invasion was possible because the people were trained, the resources were there. Then we can debate if it would have been successful or not. Actually, me and Martin agreed that it would have been a defeat for the Axis.
No,
Don't spoil.
No spoilers, because that would be an invitation for Paul to bring us back and discuss.
Oh yeah,
this,
you're coming back. Don't worry.
And have another live with your channel. This time, me talking in Italian.
Yeah, you two are coming back. There's no question about that.
Okay,
yeah, no.
Thank you.
Yeah, but anyway, they realized that, and of course, the situation has changed, and Malta is posing a threat. And then the problem, if you see the dynamics of the losses at sea from 1940 goes pretty much well for the Italians. As you recalled, things deteriorate at the end of 41, let's say from September, and then there's the Axis happy period in 42 until, let's say, early August, and then things started to deteriorate again. Then there's Torch, El Alamein, etc. The thing is, Malta was putting a toll on the supplies and on the merchant navy in an attrition war that Italy and also Germany could not afford to win. So Malta was an additional toll that they decided at some point to eradicate to decrease this toll. But again, if 100% of the supplies that were sent to Libya would have arrived, I still doubt that they could have won because of geography.
There wouldn't have been enough. Not enough supplies for being sent in the first place. Yes.
Yeah, because of the geography of the theater, which favored the British in a way, but also because of the sheer amount of supplies that the Eighth Army received compared to what Rommel received overall. But that's another story. Back to our 1940 argument. As I said, the planning from the Italian side went on, and a final version was delivered in the 18th of June, 1940. This plan was called Investimento di Malta. And it was presented after the collapse of France. There were already talks for the armistice with the French, so the political situation had changed a lot, and would have changed also on the military side. This this final version of the 18th of June downsized the amount of men required to 20,000. I suspect that this reduction of the men required was linked to the unavailability of enough transport to land the troops,
Right.
so that you could muster 4 landing crafts. I told you that there were 5, but the plan only mentions 4. I don't know the reason for that. 4 plus around 100 bragozzi, the wooden fishing boats I showed you before. So probably this is the amount that of people that could have been transported by this means. And,
so a question, just to interrupt you, a question that came in quite early on from Lancaster again. He said he had read that Italian intelligence overestimated the strength of the garrison on Malta, but if they're reducing the number of are they? It's the opposite, is it? They're underestimating it.
No, actually, their estimate was quite right. In this document, there is a table. I don't remember if I put the image, but the Italians at this point estimated 12,800 people defending Malta. So it's 1,000 short from my estimate.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing, yes. The thing is that the regiments that were in Malta in the summer of 1940, when this invasion could have happened, okay, they had been here for quite a few months, and the first reinforcements of the war came in November. I have a table here. Actually, like the Devons, the Hampshires, okay, the Dorsets, the they were already there in the summer, and the Buffs came in November. Durham Light Infantry came in January 1942. So the bulk of the forces available in 1942 were already in Malta in 1940. And therefore, the estimate for the summer of 1940, they had the time to actually gather intelligence. Remember that until the 10th of June, the Italian airline, Ala Littorio, was still flying from Malta. It was still taking pictures of every inch of the ground in Malta. They have an extremely good idea of what Malta was like until the 10th June. Then they had to rely on aerial reconnaissance. Then the Germans did extremely good aerial reconnaissance. We have very good photos from and plans from the Bundesarchiv that have survived the war. But what they didn't have, reliable intelligence from the ground after the 10th of June 1942, because things would have changed in Malta. But I think I would agree that there was no overestimation, at least in terms of the fixed defenses and the ground troops. Okay, in terms of the Royal Air Force, it was quite obvious when you go up with your air ticket and fly back to Italy, and you look at the airfields. So you look at Taali, that is Takali, where the fighter base, no airplanes. You look at Luca. Luca is the bomber airfield, the only one with concrete that would take heavy bombers. No bombers. Look at Halfar. Oh, 3 or 4 old biplanes. That's all the Air Force we had. So it's quite so where are the planes? If we know that there were no pens, no underground hangars or whatever where they could hide there. So that was it.
Yeah. The estimate of the ground forces was accurate, but in the draft of the spring, there is an overestimation of the aircraft in Malta. It was around 100, so crazy number. But then after they put their eyes on Malta, they saw that no relevant air forces were available. Then coming to the details of the plan, the 100 Bargozzi were divided among several beaches. You see, those places that we mentioned before, Melia, St. Paul's, were to be attacked with 10 Bargozzi carrying a certain number of people. 4 were destined to this location near Fort Maddalena, near the Victoria Line. 2 20 Bragozzi were destined to Marsa Schlock, which we call in Italian Marsa Scirocco, and 5 others were destined to this place, which was called Marsa Scala, I mean, at least in
Marsa
Italian.
Scala, yes.
Marsa
Marsa
Scala.
Scala.
Then 8 were destined to Gozo, the third island in the archipelago. And then 38 were held in reserve that were meant to be destined to these places where the landing forces would have encountered stiffer resistance. And then the most valuable means, so the 4 landing crafts that we saw before, so the 4 Sesia class ships, were to launch an assault on the western coast, but not at the same time of the Bragozzi, but a bit later. So the idea was to try to land in these other locations with the Bragozzi, and then land another significant force after on these western shores. The idea probably was to wait for the Maltese reserves to be destined to the other landing places, and then launch an assault here. Probably also with tankettes, because this transport were able to land tankettes, and that's it. Then they would still have had a hard time breaking through the Victoria Line, but this is another story. Again, this was the plan drafted. Again, about the paratroopers, I saw some comments in the sidebar mentioning the paratroopers. The paratroopers are mentioned in the study that should be launched on the airfields, but it's important to remember that at this point in time, Italy had very few paratrooper units, around 100 Italian officers, and around 300 Libyan paratroopers that were deployed in Libya. So again, maximum 400, 500 paratroopers, they are not enough to launch this this kind of area assault. And remember, at this point in history, neither the German have launched massive air assaults like we will see in Crete. We know Eben Emael in Belgium, but these were commando size operations, so nothing massive as Malta would have required. Then also, sometimes I get people telling me, yeah, but the Germans invaded Crete with the paratroopers. The same thing could have been done in Malta. Well, it's not the same, because Malta is much smaller than Crete, so the paratroopers would have landed on a smaller.
That's another program, Giulio.
Yeah, but to give an idea,
yes,
at this
of course,
point, paratroopers would have had a tough time in dropping over Malta. But yeah, this is another story. In the document, the naval bombardment was judged to be difficult because of the coastal defenses that could target destroyers and cruisers, but mostly destroyers would have provided the close naval support. And then the problem was that they judged the naval bombardment ineffective at the most delicate moments of the landing, because it would have caused probably friendly fire. The Italians had never trained for this, and this was really a novel operation for everybody. So it was difficult. It would have required the entire fleet to be mobilized, and that's for sure. But then it would have faced the Mediterranean fleet, and at this point in June, also without France in the war, the Mediterranean fleet at this point had in June, I still think, 4 battleships, and the Italians only had 2. So there was this problem, and the Italian fleet was forced to protect the invasion convoy. So the room for maneuver was limited. They spoke openly about the Maltese rebellion. The rebellion of the Maltese regiments, probably the King's Own Malta Regiment and the militia. But this is actually in the document. They say the eventual rebellion of the Maltese would help us a lot, because this endeavor is very risky and problematic. So they mention this, but not as a certainty. So they are not.
I'll tell you what would have happened. After the first air raids on the morning of the 11th of June, The gunners weren't that successful, but they had a good time firing. Okay, and remember that our anti-aircraft defenses were a mixture of the Royal Malta Artillery, 100% Maltese, and British regiments, which the British batteries by the British, the heavy anti-aircraft guns. You know what they did? At the end of the first air raid, the Maltese gunners started singing the God Save the King.
Of course.
There you have it, the rebellion.
Yeah, that's it.
But
No, but
but that was the situation.
no, yeah, but in fact, also the document does not bet on the Maltese rebellion and the overall gloomy and pessimistic assessment. Yeah,
Even
coming to
in
the conclusion.
1942, yes.
Yeah,
But
coming
yes,
to the
but there were some Maltese living in Italy who would be scouts in the landing
that's
in
true.
1942. Act as scouts, yes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so coming to the conclusion, it's very interesting. The document says clearly says that it's a very difficult task. The defenses are strong. We cannot grant the command of the sea. So in the end, the conclusion is it worth the effort? No, because there are no substantial military forces stationed in Malta that could threaten us. So why to risk such an endeavor now for which we don't have any reasonable chances of success? For what is the end goal? Remember that at this point in time, the collapse of France was a shock to the war, and it was a confirmation, first of all, to Mussolini, and also was the impression of all the people around the world, and especially in the Italian military, that the war would have ended soon, especially after the collapse of France. So that's the context in which this plan is finalized. And they say essentially the air bombardment and patrol with torpedo boats around the waters of Malta will be sufficient to keep Malta in check. And then the final paragraph says, we will get Malta after the final victory. So there is no mean to risk this endeavor now, because the war will end soon and we will get Malta at the peace table. So that's the conclusion, which at this point in time was quite reasonable, given the atmosphere, what was said around, and given the collapse of France. So that's how the invasion of Malta in 1940 was not possible, as we try to explain.
But yes, as you can see from this map, the Italians and the Germans, they came to rule that conclusion, because in 1941 the situation changed so rapidly, especially with the arrival of the German forces in the Mediterranean and North Africa, and Malta actually started its operations as an offensive base. And from there, you have the range of light bombers and heavy bombers. Bombers from Malta could bombard Rome if they wanted. Okay, they could bombard all the Italian naval installations, the main fleet bases, except those in the very north. Okay, like Genova and Livorno. Other than that, they would be available. Obviously, you need to have proper bomber squadrons in Malta, but they had. So the old swordfish, yes, operated from Malta, then albacores, Wellingtons were quite successful, and later on in the war there were the Beauforts, there were the Beaufighters. Yes, indeed. So even in 1940, there wasn't a real case to invade Malta. That became quite obvious in 1941. And hence, that's why in late 1941, the Italians restarted the planning of the invasion of Malta. And by the time, Rommel was actually already quite engaged in North Africa. And this was his assessment. Without Malta, the Axis will end up losing control of North Africa. And this said by Rommel, the same Rommel who in June 1942 told Hitler, give me the supplies to go straight ahead to the Suez Canal and forget Malta. The same person. If he had remembered what he had said a few months earlier, Malta first, and stuck to the plan. Because when Hitler and Mussolini met at Klesheim in April 1942, the agreement was, yes, Rommel will launch the offensive in May. He will take Tobruk and remain there, or he won't proceed towards the Suez Canal. But Tobruk fell much earlier. It was a much easier victory. And when he saw the road in front of him quite open towards the canal, he said, "This is it. Either we do it now, or we'll never be able to do it." He convinced Hitler. Rommel being one of his favorite generals, Hitler conceded, yes, we will not stop. And yeah, because the plan was, so they would stop at the border with Egypt. They would invade Malta, so transfer forces from North Africa, invade Malta. After invading Malta, they would retransfer the forces to North Africa and continue with the advance towards Suez Canal.
Yeah.
That was
and
the idea.
Hitler actually, Rommel convinced Hitler convinced Mussolini, and then Mussolini ordered his military leaders to comply. And the Italian Supreme Command, the Navy, the Army, they were all mad at Rommel because they wanted to go after Malta to ease the logistical situation because of the reasons I explained before. And yeah, Martin said it correctly. Rommel changed mind after Gazala and went for Suez and ultimately El Alamein. And also, as he mentioned, the plan of 1940 that I described, in May 1941, there was a first document from the Italian Navy Supreme Command called Supermarina, where they reassessed the Malta situation. At this point, Malta had received reinforcement. There was also, for a short period in April, May, there was a surface force there that was recalled for the Crete campaign. That caused some troubles to the convoys there. And then in December, the end of 1941, there is the new cycle of planning that eventually leads to the preparation of Operazione C3, or Unternehmen Hercules, as it is said in German. But that's another story that probably we will tell in another episode.
We'll do that. We'll do that another time. I mean, fantastic stuff. And my first immediate takeaway, then we'll do some questions, is that it's a stark reminder of how quickly, particularly aviation technology, changed from 1940 to even 1941, let alone 1942. I mean, right now, the aircraft that are flying around in the military today are the same ones that are flying around 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But World War II sees those such huge and swift advances that you'd have had to have been a genius in 1940 to have predicted the range of bombers 2 years later, the range of everything, drop tanks, fighter bombers. So that's the first reminder. We'll do some questions now, if you don't mind, folks. Then most of them you kind of answered as you went along, but they're kind of random ones there. Michael asked about, were there after the 1940, were there German or Italian intelligence assets amongst the Malta population?
We think so. We suspect it. Actually, one, I think it was the base commander of Takali. He was interviewed after the war, and his interview is in the Imperial War Museum's library. And actually, he mentioned that he had experience in flying boats, and therefore he knew Morse code very well. And at one point in 1942, they intercepted some Morse code communications, which was clearly coming out of Malta and was directed towards Rome. So yes, I would think that there were assets, but they still had an incomplete picture. And that's the reason maybe why Carmelo Borges Pisani, the Maltese who was executed, who was captured in Malta, because he landed in Malta to do some espionage work. And he was asked specifically to see whether there was a radio station on Filfla, a smaller island, about some emplacements, etc., in view of the invasion, the planned invasion in the summer. So yes, there were some assets, but I would not think they were giving extremely valuable or very accurate intelligence. But we don't know it yet. We don't know.
Okay.
What we know is that on the other side, on the flip side, Ultra was already very active, and Ultra knew in 1942 that the Italians were preparing, and the Germans were preparing for the invasion, but then suddenly happened, and with the Luftwaffe being transferred in the late April, early May from Sicily to the Eastern Front for Fallblau, the operation that would lead to the Battle of Stalingrad. So in a way, Battle of Stalingrad also saved Malta, but that's another program. So Malta knew by that time there would be no invasion. The question was whether food supplies and ammunition and fuel would get through between May and August. There are other questions, I think. Yes. Did Kesselring comment on Malta? Yes,
yeah, I was going to ask you that one.
In his famous book, he said, for example, that he ordered the Germans to respect civilian population and civilian property in the Blitz of March-April 1942. When the Germans were trying to subdue Malta. Malta was on its knees in April 1942. Okay, and that is why there were little losses for the Axis convoys from Italy to Northern Africa at the time, because of offensive operations on Malta were zero. Even the submarines were withdrawn from Malta. Malta was on its knees in military terms. Okay, the few Spitfires, and in April they were shot down or destroyed on the ground within a couple of days. Okay, it was only in May that the batch of Spitfires coming in May that they managed to defend the island and gain a little bit, not air supremacy, but they could defend the island better. So yes, Kesselring said that he ordered that private property would be respected. No, to hell with that. Valletta and Floriana, Valletta being the capital, a lot of civilian buildings were destroyed. No, the Germans, the Luftwaffe definitely did not do that. And in his book, he said that the Maltese were quite grateful that their property was respected. No. Not at all. Not at all.
One word on Kesselring. He was pretty much in agreement with the Italian High Command about the priority given to Malta, and he was almost always in disagreement with Rommel.
Okay. Yes. Let me another one about airfields. You know, you talked earlier about the assets that weren't available because they weren't supporting the empire in 1940, but had there been other aircraft available, were the airfields that existed in Malta in 1940 good enough for the stuff? I mean, when you talked about the later ranges, did they have to improve the airfields in sort of 41, 42?
No, the amount of aircraft, the airfields were, yes, they were improved, they were increased, but the main bomber airfield at Lua, okay, it was the only one that had a concrete airstrip,
right?
So it could take heavy bombers, and in fact, it was ready just in time in the summer of 1940, and it took bombers, and even other airfields like Ta'ali was, you know, it wasn't the typical British airfield. Instead of the turf, you would see actually the rock, the dust. Okay, but it did take like bombers, like Buford's, fighters, without mosquitoes later, without any problem. So yes, Malta could be a good house. Any kind of bomber or fighter available to the Royal Air Force or the Fleet Air Arm, for that matter, in 1940.
Okay, well, there are other questions, but we're going to save them for another time, because it'd be nice to bring this on under 2 hours, because that helps the algorithm. But yeah, absolutely fantastic presentation, because as with all good presentations, it raises as many questions as it answers them. You know, you got me thinking, and you've got the viewers thinking about possibilities, and there's also discussions in a sidebar about Rommel's appreciation of logistics and how many supplies actually were getting through to North Africa, and did Rommel, you know, misjudge the situation. But that's all. We've discussed that with Richard Hammond. I think we've discussed that with you in the past, Giulio. That sort of thing we can discuss later on. But particularly, I mean, both of your contributions, but particularly yours, Martin, giving us that Maltese point of view, because I think it's a story that tends to get written about a little bit from the British, and it's interesting hearing your perspective, as you say, being able to understand Italian sources, Maltese sources, giving us a rounder picture. So fantastic stuff. I will end it there, folks. Thank you for your questions. I've got a day off tomorrow, and then Friday we're back talking in a tribute show to Tim Cook, the Canadian historian who passed away last month. Looking forward to hearing from some of his colleagues and about his legacy there. So as always, there are links to websites and things in the description below. There's a link to Martin's book that you can buy at shops in Malta or order it from your favorite bookstore online. Giulio's website, his 2 YouTube channels, the Italian one and the English one, lots of stuff there. But in the meantime, thank you both of you. It's been I felt very international. It was like a sort of Eurovision Song Contest tonight. Malta, Italy, England. It felt very.
We've been wanting to win that for decades.
Well, we British haven't won it for yonks. Anyway, I will see you all next time, everybody. Thanks everybody for your contributions. Bye.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.